Hi everyone, this is William with the series called Life on the Magic Mountain, where we talk about Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain, Zauberberg, which turns 100 years old this year. And we talk about it within the broader context of what life was really like in a tuberculosis sanatorium in Davos, which is the setting for the novel, and also the way it is described by an actual patient, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia. And in his case, the fact that he was a Grand Duke is more or less incidental to what we're discussing. The important thing is that he left a diary of his time at Schatz Alp. And he was separated by quite a few years from what Thomas Mann presents. So the Mann novel, The Magic Mountain, starts in 1907 and ends in 1914, and Dmitri would not arrive at Schatz Alp until 1939, and he would die there in 1942. And I just now mentioned Schatz Alp. If this is your first time watching an episode of this series, you'll know that I am, for a few months every year, the historian in residence at the most famous Davos sanatorium, which is now a hotel, and it's called Schatz Alp, and it's up on the side of a mountain, so higher up than the fictional Berghof sanatorium where Hans and his cousin Joachim are staying, although the Berghof was based on a real sanatorium, Wald Sanatorium, now Wald Hotel, which is above Davos, just not as high up as Schatz Alp is. Okay, so today we're up to a chapter called, Of Course, a Female. So a rather sexist title for the chapter, but it is clearly the protagonist's view of things, Hans Castorp. It's his perspective. The door is slammed. This is his first full day at the sanatorium, but this is his third meal is described in this chapter, and 3 times in a row a person entering the dining room has slammed the glass door leading into the dining room, and that disturbs him so much that even though it's rude, he decides on the 3rd time to turn around and see who it was, and his reaction is, of course, a female. It's a young woman. We have kids out playing at the moment, even though I'm doing this by candlelight. I would have loved it when I was their age if my mother had let me play outside at 8 o'clock at night, but I had to wait until I was older. Anyway, I don't know if you can hear them or not, but if you can, yeah, it's a nice sound anyway. So let's get down to it. What are the themes today? The themes are the different ways in which patients assessed their fellow patients and their life at the sanatorium. And we've already talked about that from various perspectives, but it's crucial to understanding the book. Okay, so it starts off with Joachim with the gong ringing out to call the patients to lunch. Joachim and Hans are in their respective rooms, which are next door to each other, and Hans hears the gong ringing, but it's not for lunch itself. It's to let the patients know that lunch will be served soon, and they will hear a second gong to let them know that they need to go down to the dining room now. This is only healthy patients. It was a privilege to be able to go down to the dining rooms, and that was determined by the doctors. The doctors might tell you that you couldn't go. So Dmitri experienced both aspects of that, both being told that he couldn't dine downstairs and being told that he now was able to. Okay, so if you go to Schatz Alp and you walk through the corridors where the guest rooms are, you will see that there are still bells in the corridors. And so they're not gongs, but they're bells. And I think Mann uses the word mechanical. He uses first the word that is translated gong, and then the word for a mechanical clang. And so probably also in Berghof they had these electric bells that would call the patients to meals, and you will still find them in the corridors at Schatzalp, but don't worry, they are not going to ring. I've been going to Schatzalp now for 30 years, and I have not yet heard them ring. I don't even know if they're still connected. Okay, so Joachim is upset because when he comes to Hans Castorp's room, he finds that Castorp isn't quite ready. And the last thing Joachim wants is to be late. And he makes a statement equating punctuality actually with health. So for Joachim, the best way to reconcile himself to the fact that he is seriously ill is to imagine that if he is completely disciplined in obeying the rules of the house, he will get well. So, and he's also a military man, so he is equating punctuality with health and with the cure. And down they go. And Hans Castorp is in one of these stupor estates that he loves so much from childhood on, when he was given by the adults in his life mugs of porter to drink, and would enter this kind of stupor estate, and he still loves to be in that state. And when he gets back to the dining room for lunch, he imagines that no one has left, because it's exactly the same way it was the previous two meals. And he likes that sense of no one has, nothing has changed. He likes that sense very much. Everybody sits down in the same seat at the same tables, and it allows him to continue with this contemplation and this illusion that time does not pass in a sanatorium. So here we have an interesting list of patients, some that we know and some that we don't know. But before we get into that, I'll just say that this very vulgar woman who sits at Hans and Joachim's table, Frau Stur, she is upset because the doctor, Dr. Behrens, is not sitting at her table, the table that she shares with 9 other patients, or at least there are seats for 9 patients. And there are 7 such tables in the dining room, and he is supposed to sit at each table in turn, but she reckons it's her table's turn, but he's not sitting there, and so she feels quite slighted about that. And so she insinuates that the reason is that there's an attractive woman who wears low-cut dresses at one of the other tables. So did the doctors play favorites? Well, in Dimitri's case, it kind of seems like they did. I doubt that the doctors were having dinner with him in the sanatorium, but Dr. Maurer, or in the dining room, but Dr. Maurer and his wife, Frau Maurer, did invite him to their home. So this is at Schatzalp, and Schatzalp has a villa, the Villa Guarda. It still exists. You can book it, and that was where the chef arts, the chief doctor, lived with his family. And Maurer would invite Dimitri to come there for dinner, well, for lunch. I can't remember if he came for dinner or not, but I think so. And this was certainly a particular sign of favor. I certainly don't think he did this with all the patients. And Dimitri would also have lunch on a couple of occasions with Frau Maurer, lunch or tea. Actually, I think it was tea with Frau Maurer in town, at a cafe in town, and once with Dr. Maurer as well. and Dr. Maurer would take him on fishing trips. And Frau Maurer came and visited him and gave him some much needed commiseration and consolation the night before he was supposed to have surgery. So he was getting special treatment, I think. I mean, I've heard that Dr. Maurer also took other patients fishing, and that he did this when he had patients who were, in his estimation, about to fly the coop because they were depressed and they were sort of tired of the monotony of sanatorium life. And so then he would take not just Dmitri but other patients on these fishing excursions and maybe give them a little extra attention as well. And Dmitri was kind of a depressive type, so whether this special attention was because he was a Grand Duke or whether it was just because he was a patient who had this strong tendency for depression, probably a combination of both. But one question I can't answer is whether or not the doctors in real life at Schatz Alp joined the patients in the dining room for meals. And I've seen pictures of the dining room at Schatz Alp from the early years, from around 1906, I think, and 1909 maybe, and they have actually individual tables in the dining room and some communal tables. So it wasn't so at the Berghof, the way Mann describes it, there are only these communal tables, each of which has 10 places, and there are 7 of them, so room for 70 patients. Of course, not all patients are coming down for meals. Okay, so I'm always interested because right now I'm researching the percentages of nationalities who were at Schatz Alp at any given time and checking those against the statistics in town that were published locally, both in the local newspaper and in a journal that was for tourists and sanatorium patients called the Davoser Blätter. So you had the Davoser Zeitung and the Davoser Blätter, and both of them would publish in every issue statistics for what nationalities were currently in residence in Davos, whether as tourists or whether they were staying longer at sanatoriums and that sort of thing. And so this really interests me because of that research that I'm doing. So Frau Stor is whom we've already met, is a German woman. We also have at Hans Castorp's table Miss Robinson, who's an English woman. Is she a teacher? I don't think so. I think that's another German woman. But Miss Robinson is English. We have some Russians. Frau Shosha, who will play such a big role in the book, is Russian. Herr Blumenkohl, who sits at Hans Castorp's table, is a Jewish man from Odessa. Maruzia, Joachim's crush, and her great aunt are Russian and speak Russian, and they speak Russian to Herr Blumenkohl at the table. Frau Solomon, who is the attractive woman sitting at the other table that may or may not be the reason why Dr. Behrens is sitting at that table. She is from the Netherlands. She's from Amsterdam. Captain Michlosich is from Bucharest, so he's Romanian. Frau Wormbrandt is from Vienna, and Prosecutor Paravant is from Dortmund. So at any given time at Schatz Alp, you usually had a large predominance of Germans, but not always. There were a couple of times then when there were more English than Germans, more Portuguese than Germans. Schatz Alp was really the only sanatorium, for whatever reason, who had Portuguese patients. So no Portuguese patients appear in the Berghof in the Magic Mountain. But you certainly have this same mixture of English, Russian, Dutch, Romanian, Austrian at Schatz Alp. And in fact, on any given guest list, you would have a good chance of finding all of these nationalities mentioned at or in residence at Schatzalp, and in particular Vienna. There was a time when there were a lot of patients from Austria and specifically from Vienna. Not so many from other parts of Austria, sometimes Salzburg, but Vienna really dominated, and sometimes indeed it was, you had the biggest concentration of any group of patients from a single city were people who lived ordinarily in Vienna. Dortmund I haven't really come across. Amsterdam, in a few cases, there are times when there are, four or five Dutch patients at Schatzalp over the course of a year. An entire year, you would maybe have 4 or 5 Dutch patients. And there was actually a Dutch sanatorium in Davos. I'm not sure exactly when it was built, but naturally that was a big draw. If you came to Davos from the Netherlands, the natural place for you to go would be to the Netherlands sanatorium. But if you wanted the luxury and prestige of the foremost sanatorium in Davos, then you would be motivated to go to Schatzalp. Okay, so we see here through Hans Castorp's eyes this sort of fundamental division between patients who are lively and talkative and scoop their food up, and despite the fact that they have this illness and that some of them are very seriously ill, they are lively and they're enjoying life and they're breaking all the rules. And you have those juxtaposed with the gloomy types like Herr Blumenkohl, who just stares down into his plate as he eats and doesn't want to talk to anyone. And our Grand Duke Dmitri would certainly have belonged to that latter category. He had been quite a lively chap in his life and big on the social scene, but when he was at Schatzalp, he was more like Joachim. He just wanted to get better. He wanted to focus on that, and he had his struggle with depression. So yeah, that's where he was. So that's one sort of basic way of categorizing the patients, whether they were the kind of people who approached having a potentially terminal illness by saying, I'm going to fit as much life into my remaining months or years as I can, and the rules be damned, and I'm just going to live my life sometimes hedonistically, but enjoying myself. And then on the other hand, you have the types who have kind of given up, who are maybe depressive like Dmitri and, not that optimistic about their future. So that was a very fundamental distinction between patients. Another distinction is, were they civilized people or were they uncivilized people? And that plays into this whole thing about, maybe they were uncivilized because they just didn't give a damn anymore. They were just going to enjoy life no matter what. So anyway, Frau Sturr, who's interested in sexual things in general, well, at least I don't know if she's interested in sex itself, but she's interested in who's hooking up with whom and sort of the lurid side of that. And she informs everyone that the other night this Captain Miklosic from Bucharest turned out the lights in the upper common lounging area, the one on the roof. So what would that be? So that would be what you would call, in sanatorium parlance, what did they call it? Well, I brought that up and now I don't remember. Liga Hall or something like that. So it was, if you could not afford a room that had a balcony. So at Schatzalp, for instance, there are south-facing rooms that have balconies. There are north-facing rooms that don't have balconies. These days, all the south-facing rooms have balconies, but that wasn't always the case. There was a time when the sanatorium was initially built, and for quite a while thereafter, some of the south-facing rooms didn't have their own balconies, but everybody was expected to go outside and do the Liegekur, and you would either do that on your private balcony as Hans and Joachim do, or if you didn't have one of those rooms, you would go to what the translator calls the common lounging area. You could call it a cure hall, for instance. And so there's hanky-panky going on there. The lights have been turned off. Frau Stur is delighted by this, and she talks about what a rage Dr. Behrens had flown into when he discovered this. And she says that, or the narrator, or, the omniscient narrator, Thomas Mann, tells us that it was the lounging area on the roof. Well, Schatzalp does not have. Schatzalp has two wings, actually, and the common lounging areas, the cure halls at Schatzalp, were to the east and west of the main building, facing south, but on the east and west sides of the building. And they were called solaria because that's where you went to get sun. And there's no roof lounging area or cure area. And honestly, when I'm in Davos, I very frequently walk past the Wald Hotel, which was the Wald Sanatorium, the Berghof, and I've never noticed that it had a roof that had any kind of solarium on it or cure hall, but yeah, maybe. Okay, so going further, so we have uncivilized patients at the table who are throwing bread pills at each other, rolling their rolls, the pieces of their bread, into little pills and throwing them at each other. So this would be an example of very uncivilized behavior, although I have to weigh in on that and say that the Romanovs, the Russian royal family, were notorious for throwing bread pills at each other when they had a family gathering, and obviously not when they were, when it was a state dinner for a diplomat or a head of another state or something like that. Okay, so anyway, now let's talk about three of the characters that we know and how their distinct perspectives and how they divide their fellow patients into distinctive groups. So Joachim, Hans's cousin, who's a man who had just started on his military career when he got ill and had to go to the sanatorium and just can't wait to get back to his military career. Well, Joachim divides patients in terms of nationality. So they're either German or they're foreigners. And so for him, the desirable patients are German, and the not so desirable patients are foreigners, and he doesn't really want to have anything to do with the foreigners. He is unfailingly polite, and he's a very kind-hearted person, and he'll make an effort. For instance, he speaks a few words in English to this English woman at his table who seems very isolated because she doesn't speak any German and she has to bring a book to the table. So, Joachim is really a warm-hearted person, but he is constantly making these comments to the effect that, I don't mingle with foreigners, and he surely would not have if it wasn't for the fact that Hans Castorp insists that he does. Okay, so, I'm sure there were people at sanatoriums just like Joachim who wanted to be with their countrymen and didn't really have the time of day for people of other nationalities, but that would have been difficult unless you were in one of the sanatoriums. There was a German sanatorium, there was this Dutch sanatorium, and other nationalities, and there was an English sanatorium. Unless you were in one of those, you were going to be in a very international atmosphere. You could have, I think the record at Schatzalp was patients from 31 different nationalities was the highest I've seen, all there at the same time. And so it would have been easier for a German like Joachim to stick to other Germans because, as I said, the numbers favored the Germans at any given time. But, if you were there and you were only the only Bulgarian or the only person from, Argentina, then you would have to interact with your fellow patients from other countries. But anyway, that is how Joachim divides things, and he also likes to assess people on the basis of his own military standards, whether they're late, habitually. So someone like Frau Chauchat, who's actually Russian despite her French surname, she arrives late to the table every day, and so Joachim, that's going to be a big black mark when he looks at her from his perspective, that she's not a disciplined person. So he has those two criteria. Where are you from? Anywhere outside of Germany, not so great. And are you a disciplined person? So Hans Castorp does not draw these same characteristics. Hans Castorp is more inclined to divide people by behavior. He's not the kind of fellow who's going to like this throwing of bread pills at the table. He doesn't like people who are vulgar. He doesn't like this kind of vulgar, uncivilized, loose behavior. And the reason for that is because Hans Castorp is a snob. So what Hans Castorp does is draw class distinctions, not ethnic or national distinctions. So he assesses people by his values as belonging to this wealthy and important merchant class in Hamburg. So people who are the leaders of society and also leaders of the local administration of their city, and the haute bourgeoisie, you could say, pardon my bad French pronunciation. And so consistently throughout the book, that is how Hans is dividing people up. The first time he meets Herr Settembrini, even though Herr Settembrini is very poor and threadbare and lives in this little garret room at the sanatorium and then later one in town, Hans Castorp assesses him immediately as being a gentleman, even though he also has some sort of German chauvinistic ways of looking at people. So he also, Herr Settembrini reminds him of Italian organ grinders that he saw in Hamburg as a child. But he's very open. He's not as open to meeting with people who he considers beneath him socially, but he is open to people of other ethnicities and nationalities, and he even seems to enjoy that. And there is one person whom he assesses to be beneath him socially, and that is Frau Chauchat, whom he falls head over heels in love with. So he's got a little bit of flexibility in that respect too. And she's uncivilized because she comes late, she slams the door, and because when he gets a look at her hands, he sees that they're not nice at all. She chews her nails, and she has stubby fingers, and her hands are red, and he specifically notes that they are not tended in the way that the women of his circles in Hamburg took care of their hands. And so that's a black mark. But on the other hand, he consistently refers to the women in his own town who are of his class and who are marriage prospects for him, if he ever leaves the sanatorium, as silly geese. And Frau Chauchat may be déclassée, but she's not a silly goose. She's very intriguing. She's mysterious and alluring. And even though he, in his typical snobbish way, acknowledges that she's not the kind of woman that he would ever have a serious relationship with, rather than just a fling, he still is quite enamored of her and infatuated. And we get our first description of her because this is the first time he's looked at her. Oh, my God, I'm sorry. Duke, come here. And so she has this reddish blonde hair, what we would call in the US strawberry blonde hair. She wears it in braids. She has broad cheekbones and narrow eyes. So these sort of Asian, Central Asian features that really trigger him, to use modern parlance, because he had a crush on a boy at his school, at gymnasium, who also had these broad cheekbones and narrow eyes and a Slavic name and seemingly an ethnic connection to Central Asia. And in fact, Frau Shosha is from Dagestan, so she's not actually from European Russia, although she is Russian. All right, and she sits at the good Russian table. So the good Russian table is where the civilized Russians sit. Even though she has these bad habits, she still sits at the good Russian table. And this is not an assessment that I'm making between civilized Russians and uncivilized Russians. This is a German division of Russians into these two categories. Okay, so we have Hans with the social distinctions, we have Joachim with the national distinctions, and finally we have Frau Stor, this woman that everybody else laughs at because she's vulgar and shallow, and she tries to use big words and ends up botching them and doesn't realize that she's botched them. So how does she assess her fellow patients? Well, with respect to whether they're having illicit affairs or not, on the one hand, but that's minor. The main way she assesses her fellow patients is by gradations of illness. So she talks about her level of illness and their level of illness, and it's kind of contradictory for her, because on the one hand, she wants to be seen as one of the serious patients, one of the seriously ill patients, but on the other hand, she likes to crow when there's somebody in her circle that is, much more far advanced, much closer to death or to the terminal stage of the illness than she is. So at some point, I can't remember if we've passed it or if it's yet to come, there will be, this topic will be mentioned by Mann about how there's a ranking of patients from the least ill to the most ill, and how Hans Castorp is always at the far end of as someone who's not really ill at all, who just has a slight fever, and that's the only reason why he's staying there. But that is another way that patients are ranked. So what about with Dmitri? Well, Dmitri had his own literal ranking system. Maybe you've heard about it before in one of the earlier videos because I've mentioned it. So being a military man like Joachim, he pretty quickly, upon arriving at Schatz Alp, came up with his own ranking system where the bedridden patients were privates, and then you went from there to people who could get dressed and sit up at their desks but couldn't go downstairs for meals, basically couldn't leave their rooms, and those people were NCOs. And then finally, at the very top, you had the generals who could not only go down for meals and participate in the big sort of Christmas and other celebrations that they had in the restaurant, but could also go into town and pretty much do what they pleased, and those were the generals. And Dmitri, went from private's rank to general's rank and back again, basically. But anyway, that was his way of dividing patients. He doesn't seem to have, assessed people either from the point of view of snobbishness or from the point of view of nationalities. He had friends insofar as he was willing to be social a little bit and to make friends at the sanatorium. He had, he had friends that were Italian and German and Austrian, and there weren't any other Russians, unfortunately for him, while he was there. And he had Romanian friends, some of his closest friends. So how did he divide up the patients? Well, aside from having this ranking system, when he talks about his fellow patients at Schatzalp, it's usually in terms of niceness. So such and such person passed away and she was so nice and I'm really sorry about it, or such and such person passed away and I feel bad about that, but she wasn't nice at all. And so, yeah, when he talks about his fellow patients, it's usually in those terms, nice or not nice. So that was his way of doing it. So we end the chapter with Hans Castorp going after lunch back to his balcony to do the rest cure between lunchtime and tea time. So at Schatzalp, the rest period was from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And he's sitting out there and he's thinking of Frau Sturr and how silly she is and suppressing laughter. And that made me smile because I think about Dmitri when he was a child. And he, like Hans Castorp, was really able to see the absurdity of life and the ironies of life. And he would have these laughing fits sometimes when he was 14. He seems to have outgrown them eventually, but they could be quite awkward. But unfortunately, by the time he was at Schatzalp, he was not really in a laughing frame of mind. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. I've gone almost 40 minutes, and the next chapter will be called Herr Alban, about a particularly scandalous patient at the Berghof. And yeah, I hope to see you next week for that. Bye.